In the 1970s, Norwood Park, a quiet suburb of Chicago, was known as a safe and peaceful neighborhood. Families lived comfortably, children played freely in the streets, and neighbors knew each other well. But hidden within this seemingly ordinary neighborhood, at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue, was a terrifying secret. John Wayne Gacy was a well-respected and hard-working businessman in his community. He was involved in political events, participated in local charity work, and, most notably, was known for entertaining children as a clown. Under the persona of Pogo the Clown, he attended birthday parties, visited hospitals, and brought joy to kids. But beneath the cheerful makeup and broad smile was a horrifying truth. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy kidnapped, tortured, and murdered at least 33 young men. Most of their bodies were found buried beneath his house. This is not just the story of a serial killer, it is the chilling account of how he managed to hide in plain sight for years, luring his victims into a nightmare, and how justice finally caught up with him. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942. At first glance, he appeared to be an ordinary child, but his early years were filled with hardship. His father, John Stanley Gacy, was an alcoholic and a cruel man. He constantly belittled his son, calling him weak and not man enough. Gacy endured years of physical and verbal abuse from his father, despite his mother's attempts to protect him. As he grew older, Gacy began struggling with his identity and emotions. He felt that he could never live up to his father's expectations of being a strong man. He withdrew into himself, finding solace in a world of fantasies that would later take a dark turn. One of the most significant events in his childhood was a traumatic experience of sexual abuse by a family friend. However, he never told anyone about it. He buried the memory deep inside, allowing it to fester, shaping his dark and twisted desires. As an adult, Gacy became a successful businessman. In the 1960s, he worked for a construction company and quickly climbed the ranks. He built an image of a charismatic, friendly, and dependable man. He married, had 2 children, and seemed to be living the American dream. But behind closed doors, his mind was filled with disturbing fantasies. By the 1970s, he started his own construction business and became even more involved in his community. He joined the Democratic Party and participated in local politics. He even had the chance to shake hands with First Lady Rosalind Carter in a public event. But his most notable public persona was his clown act. As Pogo the Clown, he performed at birthday parties, charity events, and hospitals. To the outside world, he was a beloved entertainer. But behind the makeup, he was a predator hunting for his next victim. Gacy's killing spree began in 1972. His first known victim was 16-year-old Timothy McCoy. He lured the boy into his home, killed him, and buried his body in the crawl space beneath his house. But this was only the beginning. He developed a horrifying method to trap his victims. He would approach young men, usually teenagers, offering them job opportunities at his construction company. Once they entered his home, he would engage them in what he called the rope trick. This was no trick, it was a brutal game of torture and control. Gacy would convince his victims to try on handcuffs, pretending it was part of a fun trick. But once they were restrained, the real nightmare began. He tortured them for hours, sometimes days, before strangling them to death. Most of the bodies were buried in the crawl space under his house. The stench of decay eventually became unbearable, leading him to start disposing of some bodies in the nearby Des Plaines River. Gacy might have continued his killing spree for years if it weren't for one mistake. His final victim, 15-year-old Robert Piest, went missing on December 11, 1978. Piest was last seen at the pharmacy where he worked, telling his mother he was going to meet a man who had offered him a job. That man was John Wayne Gacy. When Piest didn't return home, his family reported him missing. Investigators soon discovered that Gacy had been the last person to see him alive. When police searched Gacy's house, they noticed a strong odor coming from beneath the floors. This led them to obtain a search warrant, and on December 22, 1978, officers began excavating the crawl space beneath his house. What they found was beyond comprehension. 29 bodies were discovered, buried in layers, some on top of each other. The scene was so horrific that officers who entered the house needed therapy for years afterward. Realizing there was no escape, Gacy finally confessed. "I was just doing some cleanup work, like a gravekeeper." In 1980, Gacy's trial began. It was one of the most shocking cases in U.S. history. He was charged with 33 counts of murder. During the trial, Gacy showed no remorse. He even tried to plead insanity, claiming that his alter ego Jack was responsible for the murders. But the jury didn't believe him. After weeks of testimony, he was convicted and sentenced to death by lethal injection. For years, he remained on death row, even selling paintings of his clown persona to collectors. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed. His last words before his death? "Kiss my ass." The case of John Wayne Gacy left a permanent scar on American society. His crimes changed the way people viewed clowns, making them a symbol of hidden evil. His story inspired numerous horror movies and books, including It, American Horror Story, and countless other depictions of killer clowns. But beyond the horror stories, the real tragedy lies in the lives he destroyed. Families lost their sons, and a community was left in shock. His house was eventually demolished, but the land remains a haunting reminder of the horrors that once took place there. This is not just the story of a serial killer. It's a chilling account of a man who hid behind a mask of normalcy, deceiving an entire community while committing unspeakable horrors.